the motivation for this paper is the Campbell and Schiller log linearization of returns, which implies that the dividend price ratio is a function of future expected return and future expected dividend growth. An alternative way of seeing that is that the dividend price ratio has to predict either future returns or future dividend growth. So a high dividend price ratio today means that prices today are low, and therefore future expected return are going to be high. But prices today might also reflect the fact that future dividends are going to be lower, and therefore a high dividend price ratio today might suggest a future lower dividend growth. That's why the negative sign. So what's the intuition behind this formula? Well, this is just a dynamic generalization of the well-known Gordon growth formula that states that the price is approximately equal to the dividends discounted at a constant rate of return R in excess of a constant dividend growth rate G. Rearranging, we get that the dividend price ratio is a function of R, expected return, and G, dividend growth rates. Now, empirically, we see a lot of variation in the dividend price ratio. Therefore, from this identity, we see that the variation has to either be coming from changes in expected returns or by changes in future dividends. If the expected dividend growth is constant, though, all the variation we observe in the dividend price ratio only comes from changes in discount rates and risk. And none of the variation comes from changes in cash flows. So empirically, in order to determine the source of variation of the dividend price ratio, what we do is we run predictive regression of dividend growth and excess return on the left-hand side on the lagged dividend price ratio. What I have studies that run this predictive regression found. So the general finding, which is often accepted as a stylus fact, is that aggregate stock return are predictable to some extent, but dividend growth is not. And this is what I call the dividend growth predictability puzzle. And why is it a puzzle? So why is lack of dividend growth predictability important? So the lack of dividend growth predictability by the dividend price ratio is important because it implies that cash flow news about future cash flow does not affect today the dividend price ratio. Quoting John Cochrane, Dr. Didenbach paper, our lives would be much easier if we could trace price movements back to visible news about dividends or cash flows. If market price dividend ratio variation comes only from time-varying expected returns and none from varying expected growth in dividends, much of the rest of finance needs to be rewritten. In order to solve this dividend growth predictability puzzle, we should take into account cash dividends coming from M&A activities. That is cash that every single individual shareholder receives when the firm he owns gets acquired by another firm. The aggregate dividend measure that is commonly used in empirical paper does not include these dividends. Moreover, there are substantial amounts started from the 70s, and they are more volatile than ordinary dividends. Once we include these cash dividends coming from M&A activities, dividend growth becomes strongly predictable. And this suggests that there is time variation in dividend growth. This graph shows you the split or the decomposition of aggregate economy cash flow into every individual component. So the dark gray bar are what usually called ordinary dividends. That is dividends that you will receive every quarter or every year on a recurring basis, and liquidation dividend as well. The light gray bar are buybacks and repurchases. The white bars are negative because they cash inflow at the economy level, and they are net equity issues. The blue bars are M&A cash dividends. A lot of papers, well, the majority of papers have looked at the ordinary dividends. A few papers have looked at buybacks and issues. I focus and look at the blue bars. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first paper that explicitly looks at cash dividends coming from M&A activity. So as you can see, these dividends are not only big. For example, in 1998, the cash M&A dividends component is the largest amongst all aggregate economy components, but they're also extremely volatile. Now, I think over the last 30 years, the size of these dividends coming from M&A activity is approximately 60% of the size of the ordinary dividends, so they're huge. Numerically speaking, we have seen approximately 150 M&A transactions per year over the last 20 years, consistent with the recent paper by Deutsch, Carulli, and Stulz. I would like to emphasize that cash M&A dividends, the blue bars, there is no theoretical difference between those dividends and ordinary dividends in the following sense. Every single individual shareholder that owns a firm that gets acquired receives that liquidation dividend. An important focus of basically the paper follows and take the stand of the traditional individual investor or portfolio view, where the only dividends that are considered, well, cash flows that are considered dividend are those that every single individual shareholders in a firm receive. As I just told you, if you are a shareholder in a firm that gets acquired, every single one of them receives exactly as a liquidation dividend cash, differently from buybacks and issues. Just let me give you a motivating example. So at time zero, there is an investor that buys one share in a firm X for $40. Next period, this investor receives a $2 dividend, regular dividends, resulting in a 5% dividend yield. At the last period, this firm X gets acquired by another firm Y in an all-cash takeover for $100. This $100 is basically liquidation dividends that every single investor receives. And this liquidation dividend does not appear in the standard dividend measure that is often used in empirical papers, and I will talk about this later. A real example, Google and Motorola Mobility. So Google announced the acquisition of Motorola Mobility, they are both public firms, in August 2011. So this is an extract from CRSP of the time series of Motorola Mobility, and you can see that on the month of the announcement, August, the price basically jumped close to 40, which was the price per share that was offered to Motorola Mobility shareholders. And the price stayed constant. Then what happens when the Motorola Mobility gets delisted, CRSP records that as a dividend, and it records that as a special dividend, so it attached to it a special code, which allows us to back out those cash flows. And then, of course, multiply the number of shares times the price per share, and we see that these are approximately $12.5 billion. Those $12.5 billion the Motorola Mobility shareholders, a public investor, receive is not included in the standard dividend measure. So what's the contribution of this paper? I show first that the aggregate dividend measure, the most empirical paper used, that is extracted top-down from the CRSP index, does not include these M&A cash dividends. The amount of this cash flow is non-trivial, as we have seen from the graph. And most importantly, if we consider these M&A cash dividends as liquidation dividends, and the liquidation dividends are included in the ordinary dividend measure, and if they are basically like liquidation dividend, they also should be included. And an implication of that is that any paper that uses the aggregate dividend measure extracted top-down from the CRSP index maybe could be revisited to see if results hold or implication change. In particular, I focus and revisit the return and dividend growth predictability literature by using this more comprehensive, as I call, measure of dividends that includes ordinary dividends plus cash dividends coming from M&A activities. Let's look at the main findings. So the first two, this is the in-sample and out-sample predictability results. The first two columns shows you the in-sample results, old results versus the new, my results, and the second two columns, the out-of-sample results. Let's first focus on dividend growth. The fact that dividend growth is not predictable comes here. It's not predictable here, and this number you see is basically coming from the pre-war. The puzzle of dividend growth not being predictable, but the dividend price ratio is mainly happening after the Second World War. And I will show you the split. And so once you include these cash dividends coming from M&A, you see a lot of dividend growth predictability, both in sample and the same happens out of sample. As far as excess returns are concerned, in sample there is not really excess predictability by taking into account these cash dividends coming from M&A, but out of sample, there is a huge, huge improvement. So we know by Gognale-Welch that the dividend price ratio performs kind of poorly out of sample, and in fact we have out of sample negative R squared. But once you include these cash dividends coming from M&A, we get positive out of sample R squared both at the annual frequency and the quarterly frequency. Another important result is that consumption growth is to some extent in sample predictable. So I find both at the annual frequency and quarterly frequency using this dividend price ratio augmented with cash dividends coming from M&A activity, predictability for consumption growth. And the last main result is that cash flows news affect stock prices. So the variation in the dividend price ratio can be explained by both cash flow news, 70% of that, and the remaining 30% of this variation can be explained by discount rate news. There is a huge literature on predictability. Many papers study both returns and dividend growth predictability. These are just a few examples. From Campbell and Schiller, Cochrane, a few papers, John Llewellyn paper, and more recently to Jules van Biesbergen and Ralph Koijen, and a very recent working paper by Golets and Kuris who look at the return and dividend growth predictability over the last 4 centuries. So what are dividends? What kind of dividends are we talking about? So CRSP defines ordinary dividends as recurring cash dividends, that is dividends that public firms, Microsoft, Google pays every quarter, every year on a recurring basis. And liquidation dividends as well. So when a company goes bankrupt, it's a liquidation dividend and it's there. CRSP also records non-ordinary dividends as the following: M&A cash dividends, stock dividends, subscription right, and a few others like stock dividends and buybacks. So how are aggregate dividends usually measured in empirical papers? So what we usually do, we take the return with dividends of CRSP, we subtract the returns without dividends of CRSP, and that's the dividend yield, and then we multiply by the previous price level, and that's the dividends, the time series of dividends dt. So this time series dt of dividends only includes ordinary dividends, according to the previous definition. It is recurring cash flows plus liquidation dividends. Moreover, CRSP includes all sorts of issues, excluding ADRs. So ETFs, certificates, and funds are still there. So it's not a measure of common dividends performance. And lastly, there is this dividend and investment issues highlighted by Chen and Koijen and van Binsbergen, where basically if you extract this dividend time series from the annual or quarterly frequency indices, this DT, the dividends you extract are reinvested in the CRSP index itself. This is, if a firm in the index pays a dividend in February, that dividend is invested through March, April, through December. And so the dividend time series becomes more volatile because it basically inherits the properties of the returns. And so they show that if you do not take into account the investment issue, the results are completely different. So what I do, I construct my measure by taking the ordinary dividends from CRSP, standard, and I add M&A cash dividends from CRSP as well. Again, these M&A cash dividends are dividends that an investor in a firm that gets acquired receives. So it's basically liquidation dividends, and I think should be included in the dividend measure. And then, given this new dividend measure, I construct the new dividend price ratio that basically includes these cash dividends coming from M&A activity and the new dividend growth. And then I compare this measure with the standard 2 CRSP extracted dividend measure with investment and without investment. So in all these tables on these panels, the first measure will always be the CRSP extracted top-down with an investment. The second will be the dividends extracted from CRSP, the index, without investment, and the last one will be mine. So you see that there is an increase in the mean of the dividend growth, obviously, because we're adding some cash dividends coming from M&A, and there are, as we've seen from the graph, those M&A cash dividends are more volatile, and so the volatility goes slightly up. But the key, I think, is the correlation between my measure, which is built bottom-up, so there is no investment by construction, and the dividends without investment extracted from the CRSP index. So the correlation between the two, just if you look at the ordinary dividends, is very high. It's like close to 100%. Once you add on top of the ordinary dividends the cash M&A dividends, the correlation drops to 70%. So they're not the same things, obviously. Let's look at the dividend price ratio. So since we are increasing the numerator, obviously the mean goes up. But the key, I think, is the AR1 coefficient. So in this literature, one of the main problems is a statistical problem related to the fact that the dividend price ratio is often close to be a unit, thought to be unit root, and therefore all these statistical inference need to be taking into account the fact that it's very persistent. Well, once we include these cash M&A dividends, the persistence of the dividend-price ratio augmented with cash dividends coming from M&A is not close to be a unit root. And this is the graph. So the red line is my dividend-price ratio that includes cash M&A coming from cash dividends coming from M&A activities, while the blue line are the CRSP index extracted with reinvestment and the green without investment. You see that they pretty much track each other very closely. Of course, when there is a spike in M&A activity, we see that the dividend-price ratio diverge, my dividend-price ratio, and then converges back to the standard one. So you see that volatility also comes from here. So what I do, I run standard predictive regression of log dividend growth, log consumption growth, and excess returns on the log dividend price ratio to see if results change. Here are the results. So over the full sample, the standard result is that dividend growth is not predictable. When you take into account, when you do not take into account their investment, there is some predictability, but again, as I was mentioning, the puzzle is mainly post-war, and there is no predictability whatsoever just by using common dividends. Once you include these dividends, well, dividend growth becomes predictable. Note also this negative sign, which is proper, I mean, it has to be negative, consistent with the theory. And the same results hold at quarterly frequency. What about consumption growth? Consumption growth is often thought to be IID or not predictable by the dividend price ratio. And these results are exactly what we find. So when we use the CRSP index extracted dividends, we find that consumption growth is not predictable. Once we include these cash M&A dividends, well, there is some predictability. What about returns? So if you only focus on the adjusted R squared, well, there is some predictability. My measure does not perform better than the standard one in sample. But once, well, if you focus on the adjusted R squared, also post-war there is some evidence of predictability. But when we adjust the coefficient for Steinbach bias and properly calculate standard errors, the statistical evidence and power for predictability is not too strong. Out of sample. First panel shows you the dividend growth out of sample regression, and the bottom panel, the excess returns. We see that dividend growth out of sample R squared is negative using the standard measure, both at the annual and quarterly frequency. Once we include these cash dividends from M&A is not true anymore. As far as the returns, the first two lines are consistent with Goyan and Welch. There is no predictability of returns out of sample. Once we include cash M&A dividends, the out of sample R squared or Campbell and Thompson becomes positive. The statistical evidence is not too much, but even a small positive out of sample R squared can be exploited in a trading strategy. So far, I've only looked at one period ahead predictive regression. But what about longer run predictive regression? That is, what about forecasting the sum of excess returns and the sum of dividend growth on the left-hand side on the lag dividend price ratio? So I follow the framework of John Cochran, Dr. Dillenbark, and I look at the long horizon coefficient, which are implied by the 1 year ahead predictive regression, in order to determine how much of the variation in the dividend price ratio is explained by either changes in cash flows or by changes in expected returns. So what I do, I define a first order VAR, representation of log returns, log dividend growths, and log dividend price ratio. And by the Campbell and Schiller decomposition, we know that the coefficients BR, BD, and phi are related by this approximate identity. Standardizing, well, dividing by 1 minus rho times phi, we get to this part. B long run R means, I will show you what it means later, minus B long run D is approximately equal to 1. What are B long run R, return, and B long run D, dividends? Well, B long run returns and dividend represent the fraction of the dividend price ratio variance that can be attributed respectively to either time-varying expected returns or by time-varying dividend growth. And then, of course, I can test two joint null hypotheses. The first, B long run R is equal to 0, and then, of course, it has to be that the B long run D is equal to -1. which mainly means that all the variation in the dividend price ratio only comes from changes in cash flows. And the second one is the opposite. All the variation comes from changes in discount rates. This is the result. The first part of the table is the standard result that variation in the dividend price ratio is only accounted for changes in discount rates. So let's look at the coefficient. B long run R is 1, and B long run dividend is close to 0, which means all the variation comes from the returns and none comes from cash flows. Of course, the null hypothesis that all the variation comes from from cash flow news is strongly rejected, but we cannot reject the other one, meaning that the variation comes from discount rates. The second part of the table is basically the same analysis by just including cash dividends coming from M&A. What we see here is a different story. We see that 30% of the variation in the dividend price ratio comes from changes in discount rates. So discount rates are still important, but cash flow news are also important now, and 70% of this variation comes, or the variation in the dividend price ratio can be attributed to changes in cash flows. When we look at the null hypothesis, we see that both are rejected, which means it's not just discount rates, it's not just cash flow news, but it's both that really matter. Again, the puzzle is that all the variation in the dividend price ratio is accounted for only by changes in discount rates. And the solution is that, well, it seems that expected dividend growth explains approximately 70% of this variation, while the remaining 30% is explained by changes in discount rates. Now, what's the economic intuition of this result? Ordinary dividends are sticky and smoothed by managers. This is a well-known fact coming back from French papers, and more recently by Goodman, Kadan-Kandel, Leary-Michaeli, Chanda Priestley, and Golets and Kudis. We know that managers tend to smooth dividends because of the asymmetric price reaction we see in dividend cuts versus dividend raises. So when managers are afraid of cutting dividends, they don't raise it them either, and so dividends are smooth. Therefore, when a firm performs extremely well and has a lot of cash in hands, while the manager might not change their dividend policy in order to reflect this performance, they need to do something with this cash. They can just invest internally, buy back stocks, or going out and buying other firms. And it's exactly what we've seen over the recent years. Moreover, these M&A cash flows are not smoothing. Manager, before acquiring a firm, don't really think about properly smoothing them. What this means is that while ordinary dividends are smoothed, so they might not have information about or up-to-date information on the profitability of the firm, this other kind of this other kind of dividends, like cash dividends coming from M&A, might have information that is not reflected in these ordinary dividends. There are a couple of other results in the paper. I do find stronger predictability for excess return out of sample during periods of low M&A activity which are related to recessions. And this result is consistent with the many recent papers that look at the business cycle predictability. Moreover, we know that some industries are subject to more M&A activity than others, right? So a natural question would be, are those industries that are subject to more M&A activity than others more predictable? So the answer to this question is, for dividend growth, no. Any single industry I've looked at, once you include cash dividends coming from M&A, is predictable. As far as return predictability at the industry level, it's true that, especially over the post-Second World War period, only those industries whose cash M&A component relative to the standard ordinary dividend paid out is the higher. For those industries, there is more return predictability. And lastly, I showed you that these cash M&A dividends have predictive power for aggregate quantities like dividend growth, consumption growth. So a question is, can we economically exploit this predictability? And I do build a trading strategy that tries to exploit this predictability, and I find it to be more profitable than standard trading strategy that only exploit information in the standard dividend price ratio. Conclusion. M&A cash dividends are not included in the standard dividend measure that is often used in empirical papers in asset pricing. An implication of this is that if these cash dividends coming from M&A activities are basically liquidation dividend, and every single one of the shareholders receive them, then we should include them in the dividend measure. And of course, once we redefine this dividend measure, where every single shareholder receives something, then maybe papers that use the standard CRSP index extracted dividend growth measure might be revisited to see if results still hold or maybe change. What I do in particular, I revisit the predictability literature, and I show that variation in the dividend price ratio can be finally traced back to news about future cash flows. And the economic intuition I gave you is that maybe these M&A cash flows are not smoothed, so they have information content that are not reflected in standard dividends. What I also find, strong predictability for dividend growth and consumption growth at the aggregate level. Business cycle predictability, there is more strong out-of-sample excess return predictability during periods of low M&A activity, which are related to recession. And then I also find strong dividend growth predictability across any industries, once we include these cash dividends coming from M&A. And lastly, that it's possible to economically exploit the predictability that comes from these M&A cash flows. Thanks.